Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Zhang, and I'm the founder and host of Undocumented History and Non-YouTube Video Podcast. Welcome to episode 11. The strategy of pitting minorities against each other has always existed. Rather than letting minorities form solidarity, minorities have been played against each other, resulting in increased tensions. This hides the real antagonist. Fortunately, the race-class narrative can help combat this issue. In this episode, Anika and I will be discussing how the race-class narrative works, why talking about race and class is so difficult, and how the government can be used as a tool for racial justice despite the lack of trust in it. Here is my conversation with her. Hi everyone, and welcome to Undocumented History, an online video podcast focused on educating others about Asian culture and history, while also amplifying Asian voices and stories. I'm Tiffany Zhang, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Anika, the co-founder and co-executive director of We Make the Future. We Make the Future serves as an implementation home for the race-class narrative and other empirically backed messaging. Their goal is to increase the capacity of state, local, and national partners to move a race-forward narrative on the economy and democracy, so they can make a compelling case for a better future for all. Thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do and who you are?
I assume we'll have some more questions about that, but thank you for inviting me here.
Of
Excited to
course.
talk more.
Of course. So I guess my first question would be, can you talk a little bit about your background and what kind of led you to embark on this journey to fight for racial justice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much rooted in identity. So I am the daughter of Muslim Pakistani immigrants from Pakistan, and they immigrated to a really rural, homogenous community in West Michigan in the early 80s. And there wasn't like a big Muslim community there or South Asian community. We were definitely the only ones on the block. And, I think just growing up there without anyone looking like me or my family, I got bullied a lot when I was young. And I started doing a lot of things that were destructive and not healthy or helpful for my well-being. And I got into a lot of trouble. I dropped out of high school. And, I think through all those experiences, of, just like internalized racism and harm. And I eventually, had a lot of strong supports with my family, in particular, my mom, like never gave up on me and made sure that I got the help that I needed. And really like the whole point is like, why do you do destructive things? And it's like, there's usually a root cause, right? And the root cause was like, I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. And so I was harming myself because I was like, I don't look like other people. Like people don't pray like us. People don't eat like us. And so I felt like there was something wrong with us. And once I, recognized that it wasn't actually anything wrong with me, it was the systems and policies in place that make us feel like outsiders. I decided that I wanted to dedicate my professional career to never having anyone feel like that. We all belong here, no matter where we come from, what we look like, who we love, how we identify. And that is supposed to be the American ideal, right? It's just not for everyone. It doesn't actually happen that way in reality. And so that's like the more personal route that I took to get here. And so I went to school to become a social worker. I think there's many paths to fight for racial justice. I chose social work, and then I chose policy inside of social work. You can do many different types of things in social work, and I chose the policy route because I felt like if we changed legislation, it would impact millions of people at once, right? It takes decades, sometimes to introduce and pass new pieces of legislation that would impact people's lives so that for the better to advance that multiracial democracy. But that's what I committed to. And then the last route I got to where I was that if we don't communicate really effectively about why these policies matter, like who are they for, what will they achieve, then how do we get people to understand they should vote for people who would pass those pieces of legislation or why their vote matters? And so if the pieces of legislation and what would you get out of it are the inside of a present, right? I help people wrap it in the most beautiful wrapping paper so that everyone feels like that looks like I want to open it. Like I'm excited about it. And when I open it, I can see myself in it. And so like I don't focus so much on what's inside the box. Like I think a lot of groups are doing amazing work around policy agendas and what would benefit, particularly in AAPI communities, but like I help them put wrapping paper on it and help them ship it so that the people who need to see it and open it get it. And so that's kind of how I think about communications.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your journey and your story. I felt that was really empowering, and I feel like I definitely, like to an extent, understand like the, I guess, like ostracization of certain individuals based on like race, class, or like gender. And I think it was great that you had a good support system around you, like your family, your mom, definitely. And I guess this kind of journey led you to found We Make the Future, which is based on the race class narrative. So I guess for people who don't exactly know what it is or aren't really familiar with the term, I guess like can you talk more about what the race class narrative is and kind of how it's engineered?
Yeah, absolutely. So the race class narrative is a narrative framework and it's an antidote to kind of what I would say very simply divide and conquer politics. And so since the beginning of, or not the beginning, since the stealing of this country, there has been a divide and conquer strategy all the time, right? It's like make people fight each other so that they don't know that you're picking their pocket, that they don't know that they're ravaging your community, right? Like they're always trying to get you to hate the wrong person, and that person is usually of a different color, of a different faith, of a different gender identity, because it's really easy to stoke fear about somebody who doesn't do things the same way as you do, so that you don't actually know who the real villain is, right? You can think about, um, segregation, right? They had people who were working class blacks and whites, or enslaved black people and working indentured white servants, hate each other instead of the slave owners themselves, right? And so that they could have rose up together. When they tried to like, you should actually like hate each other, right? Because then that means that it will be integrated and that you will be equal, when actually that would actually, benefit everyone. Um, and so there are many manifestations that has happened, right? That they have tried to pit us against one another. And even in 2023, it continues, right? Whether that you're seeing what's happening in Gaza, what you're seeing, here just in the United States. So like when we had COVID here, right? Like the xenophobia around people who, had descended from China versus like, this is a pandemic and our government is not like keeping us safe, um, by having like a strong public health system, like free vaccines, like fully funded education. There were all different ways that we could have shown up, but they were choosing to use xenophobia instead to divide us from each other. And so this is a tactic that has manifested throughout time. It's still there. And so the race class narrative was is an antidote to that strategy, where we actually pull back the curtain of this divide and conquer and like reveal what's actually behind the villains behind it, to be like, hey, we actually all want the same things. We are different, but at the end of the day, we all want to belong. We all want to be able to put food on the table for our families. We want to be home the first time our newborn smiles. These are all things that we share, and they're trying to divide us so that we don't actually rise up and demand the things that we deserve. And calling out who those villains are, right? Is it like corporations? Is it like unaccountable CEOs? Is it politicians who have lobbyists in their pocket? Like, and that we're not going to stand for it. You're not fooling us anymore. And then you talk about ways that we have shown up for each other, right? Because you want to make people feel like, hey, we can come together, because there's a lot of cynicism and apathy right now. People feel like their voices don't matter. And so what are ways that you can show that we have come together? And then lastly, you say, give them something to do. Do you want them to call their representative? Do you want them to come to a neighborhood block party and learn more about like each other? Like, so it's kind of like calling out multiracial solidarity, saying like, hey, you're not going to divide us. We have more and shared values than you think. And then point to the real villain, right? And then naming what we've done to that together to show that we can do it again. Sorry, this balloon thing happens and I've tried to take it off my Zoom and I can't get it to turn off. And then lastly, you want to have a call to action. Like, what is the next step? And so that's like the fundamental architecture of the race class narrative, is to give us an alternative story to that story we've been told over and over again, right? That we should fear one another, that for you to get something, that means I have to lose something, right? And that we can't achieve anything together. That's actually not true.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen that with like Black communities and Asian communities,
Yeah.
like white supremacists, they pit Black and Asian communities against each other by using Asian Americans as like the model minority. And I guess like that kind of sends the message of like, why can't like you be like them either? And I guess that kind of shows like the picking and choosing of like, I guess like white supremacists when they want to be allies with Asians and when they don't. And I guess that kind of goes against like this goes with like the problem of like pitting against minorities. It's very real, very much prevalent. But I guess like what do you think the main like root or cause is?
Like, why do they do that?
Mhm.
I mean, I think it's for power, right? Because as long as we're pointing fingers at each other, we won't rise up together, and demand power. I understand that, like, just because there might be quantity doesn't mean power, right? We technically, there are more people of color in particular areas, but yet we don't have representation in those areas. So just having more numbers does not, equate to power. But if we are constantly seeing each other and falling for their tactics, like, we won't, you know, use those power in numbers to actually build power and whatever that looks like. And so, I mean, I think that's the root of it, is that, like, it's been an incredibly potent wedge to maintain and hold on to power, right? Through, like, gerrymandering districts, as you said, like, um, people in the AAPI community, like, feeling like, like they can't be in solidarity, or Black people feeling like they can't be in solidarity with us, like, because we are seen as white adjacent. But who's sharing those narratives? They are, like, and by they, I mean, like, people in power who tend to be wealthier, white, and male.
Mhm. And I guess kind of pivoting off of that, like why do you think that like talking about race and class is so difficult?
I think it's so difficult because we don't talk about it, right? But people are talking about it. So what I mean is that, like, if you look throughout time, people who are fundamentally against multiracial, like, democracy and, like, a future where everyone can thrive no matter what they look like or how they pray, there has always been a faction that is against that. And they talk about race and class all the time. They've used it through imagery, like, you'll see, like, the welfare queen, which was incredibly racialized, right? Whenever they're talking about immigrants, they're not talking about immigrants from Canada. They're not talking about immigrants from Europe. That's a racialized immigrant image. So there's that side, that faction who's never been for a multiracial democracy has always been talking about race. We are deciding not to talk about it. I think people are talking about it more than they have in the past. And there's this been idea that like, we all are equal. Why do we have to talk about race? And that's actually fundamentally, like, what's been used to divide us. Like, I think it's fine. I think it's actually healthy to talk about our differences, right? But if we use them as a way to, like, undermine that we are actually unique and different, then the other side is going to actually use that to divide us, like, very strategically.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. I feel like having open and honest conversations in school, especially, is very important because I feel like school is kind of like where people like learn all of the skills like necessary. Like I feel like if you don't learn to have honest and open conversations in school, it's gonna be harder like in the real world and also in college. But I feel like especially recently, since I guess like the United States has been more polarized, I feel like people, or I guess like some people have been more scared to talk about race and stuff for fear of like being like for fear of being like scolded or whatever, or just like reprimanded.
Yeah. I haven't been in school in a long time, and I definitely feel like when I was, we did not talk about it, but it was like I was the only South Asian student in my entire school. And so it's just like they may not have talking, nobody was talking about it, but I felt it,
Mm.
right? I felt it. And I feel like if we actually talked about it, I wouldn't feel like, is this just me? Like, I
Mhm.
don't know what it's like in, schools today. I definitely know that, like, I hope things have advanced. Like, my kids are in school and we talk about it at home. So
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely getting better though. I feel like there was this kind of, at least like where I lived, I feel like there was this type kind of period where like people were like just like don't talk about it. Like it's not for school, but I feel like conversations are definitely happening more often.
When I'm curious, like I know that, or I don't know if you're tracking like all the movement around book bans and like anti-CRT and how is that impacting, people at different levels in education? Like, are they not seeing themselves in books because they're being banned in the library or like curriculum topics? Like, there's definitely legislation that is trying to censor,
Mhm.
race in a lot of ways in a very strategic way.
Yeah, I think when I was in middle school, we talked to, or at least in my school, we talked about like banned books and stuff, and just like books that have been like removed, like wanting books that people have wanted to be removed from libraries and stuff. But I guess kind of going off of that, or kind of pivoting more, kind of wanted to talk about like trust in the government, I guess. So trust in the government right now has been particularly low, like the lowest it's ever been in the 7 decades of polling, according to a report done by Pew Research Center in 2023. I guess my question to you would be like, how can the government regain its trust and be used as a tool for racial justice?
It's a great question, one that's been guiding my work for a really long time. Thank you for asking it. I think that we often talk about the government in such a in a big way when it's actually there's so many levels of government and people have different relationships with different levels of government. Like oftentimes people have a lot of trust in their local government, right? Because they actually have interactions with city council or like government's also your postal workers. It's also like the people who, teach your kids at school. Like there are many layers of government. People who pick up your trash at the end of the week. Like there are so many layers of government. And sometimes when we just use the word government, people are thinking about like the politicians at the federal level, right? They're thinking about only one way of government. And so I think we need to do a better job of effectively communicating like what level of government we're talking about and making clear, because I think it's very obscure, right? Like when you ride a bus, you are using government, right? You probably know people in government who are working in your neighborhood, like or your neighbors. And so I think it's important to broaden the scope of who is in government and who could be in government. You are a part of government, right? But that doesn't mean that there are definitely people in government that should not be there, but that fundamentally the structure of our government is a set of systems and we put people in there, right? So if we throw out the whole idea of government, that's not the whole structure was to have something that's accountable to all of us, which is how we contribute with our, resources through taxes and all these types of things so that we can do things collectively that we couldn't do individually. And so we have to name the particular people that need to change in government, not the entire system. We
Mhm.
can make like it more accountable, we can make it more equitable, but it's up for us to shape that. So I like to think of government as a tool that has been wielded for violence and oppression, but it also has been a tool for good, right? It's how we've created economic mobility in many communities of color. It's how, like we've been able to uphold a lot of equity initiatives that we could not do on the corporate and private side. And so it's really up to us to shape it and feel like power in it. And so another thing I would say is that when we are in advocacy spaces and we are communicating to people, we often say, like, government's doing this, government's doing that. It's so terrible. Now go vote. Like, you just said all these terrible things, but then at the same time, you're telling people to engage in that same thing. So, like, there's an ordering of operations. You have to say, like, this is the value we have in government. It is not achieving that value. This is the role you play in making that happen. And that is why you should vote. Otherwise you're just being like, why would I vote for a messed up system? It's not going to change. So you have to have you don't want to not say anything bad about. I think government should be critiqued in the ways that in like at the certain levels and certain people, but you have to like have a higher calling of what it could be if we were to engage in it and change it. Does that help answer your question, I think?
Yeah,
I
definitely.
don't went on a tangent. I'm sorry.
No, that was really good. I think, yeah, also I feel like government, maybe recently, where government has been kind of like not synonymous, but I feel like a lot of people associate government with corruption and
Yeah.
stuff. So I think that also kind of ruins the image. But I definitely agree with you. Like I think government can be thought of as a tool to like wield good, I guess, in the world. Because I feel like the idea of a government is good, and it can, and when it's like used right, it can be used to achieve a lot of things. So I guess I had like a quick question. Strategy, like would it be better to teach communities impacted by racism to recognize that they're being played, or is it better to teach like the white communities that I guess racism and
Oh,
classism are like real?
I feel like there isn't an either or, it's a both and. The race class narrative is a multiracial strategy, but they have to see each other in it, right? Because if they don't see each other in it, then it still feels like it's only benefiting me at the expense of the other. Like, except that what's happening is like we're both losing, communities of color and white people are both losing, but people of color are being used as the wedge, right? Like they're not getting the brunt equally, right? Like it's important to name that like people of color are being thrown under the bus, but all of you are, like are being impacted by that, not just people of color. So I think it's a both and.
Yeah, I think we have to have like mutual understanding and empathy, and we do have to work on both sides. So, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for speaking with me. It was so great, such a pleasure. And yeah, I guess I'll see everyone next time. Bye.
Thank you, Tiffany.